Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
Our final speaker will be Armanc Yildiz. Armanc Yildiz is a postdoctoral researcher at the Humboldt University of Berlin. He received his doctoral degree from the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University with a secondary degree in studies of women, gender, and sexuality. His work stands at the intersections of the anthropology of the body, race, sexuality, spirituality, and science. And Armanc will be speaking on spiritualizing science, scientizing spirit, boundary work among anthroposophists in post-truth Europe.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for making this very exciting event possible and including me, albeit in a virtual form. And what an honor to speak to this audience at my alma mater. My name is Armanc Yildiz. I'm a sociocultural anthropologist now based at Humboldt University in Berlin. What I'm about to present are some preliminary thoughts from a larger research project titled A Spiritual Science, Health, Body, and Knowledge in Anthroposophical Medicine. In this project, I take anthroposophical medicine as a field where science and spirituality come together in practice. And I'm aware when I mention science and spirituality coming together, there's an underlying assumption that science and spirituality are self-standing transhistorical entities that may or may not come together. But as scholars of science and religion already know, and as a lot of historians of science can attest, science and religion being perceived as separate entities, or the idea that there should be naturally a conflict between the two, are very recent developments in their long and tangled histories. Therefore, what I aim to understand in this project is how science and spirituality are articulated as sometimes separate but sometimes entangled entities, and how they are co-produced in relation to each other in anthroposophical medicine. In my presentation, though, I will not limit myself to anthroposophical medicine. I'll also bring examples from different sciences as practiced by anthroposophists to elaborate on the role of Goethe and Goetheanism in thinking about science and spirituality together. So I did change my talk quite a bit from the abstract I provided, but the main ideas I wanted to present remain the same. My talk is based on my field research in Stuttgart, where I spent time in and around Rudolf Steiner House, attending talks and seminars, joining branch meetings, and interviewing anthroposophists. Yes. I'll base the talk around the Goetheanism exhibition titled Thinking with the Eyes, a New Perspective on the Mysteries of Nature, Goethe and Rudolf Steiner, that ran between April and July this year in Rudolf Steiner House, and the accompanying conference organized by the Acanthus Academy in May. And I believe some of the speakers of the conference are among the audience of this one, such as Matthias Frank and Martina Maria Sam. Oops, sorry. Okay, here we go. So the exhibition Thinking with the Eyes opened on April 5th, one of the first days that felt truly like a spring day in Stuttgart, with the weather warm and the sun shining unabashedly. It was also a special time. It was almost a week after the 100th anniversary of Rudolf Steiner's passing the threshold of death, which was commemorated with a massive event program in the city center called the Jubileum, or the Jubilee, that took anthroposophy out of the Ulandshöhe, or the Ulands Heights, where the Rudolf Steiner House is located. In the house, Christoph Hück, the main initiator of the exhibition and one of the founders of the Acanthus Academy, greeted us and thanked us for choosing not to be outdoors on such a beautiful day. We were sitting in Café Ole, a pentagonal room that usually serves for Wednesday talks to raise funds for the renovation of the house. But this time it was organized for the opening talks of the exhibition, tables removed and chairs arranged towards the podium. Hugh continued to introduce himself, and assuming there might be people who weren't familiar with anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner, he introduced them. Indeed, this was usually unnecessary in Rudolf Steiner House. Most people attending the events were people who had devoted themselves to the study of anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner's work. However, the exhibition was publicized widely as a continuation of the efforts such as the Jubilee event, where anthroposophists wanted to break with the image of anthroposophy as being closed off from the rest of the society by organizing events in public or by attracting outsiders to the exhibition. Posters of the exhibition were everywhere in the city around this time, coincidentally together with the City Museum's exhibition on Rudolf Steiner and Anthroposophy. To give you a better idea of the exhibition in the Rudolf Steiner house, I'll read from its website, and I'm quoting, Goethe developed a view of nature whose holistic significance is becoming increasingly clear. Rudolf Steiner made Goethe's natural science understandable for our time and established his spiritual science on the basis of Goethe's phenomenology. The exhibition features interactive exhibits from the fields of physics, biology, ecology, and anthropology, which lead to one's own view of the ideas of nature. End of quote. After a brief welcome, Huck gave the floor to Armin Husemann, who was a well-known anthroposophical doctor and a Goethe researcher, who went on to talk about the centrality of Goethe's work and Goetheanism and Steiner's life and work. Husemann started by historicizing Goethe's work, describing the victory of quote-unquote reductionist materialism over holism in the 20th century. When Husemann Husemann describes here is not a characterization of history of science only by anthroposophists. As you may well know, historians of science such as Anne Harrington and many others have written about the contentions over science between the proponents of mechanistic and holistic science in the 19th and early 20th century. According to this view, and I'm quoting Harrington here, science had declared humanity's life and soul a senseless product of mechanism. The spread of mechanistic, instrumentalistic thinking into all areas of professional and cultural life had given rise to a cynical, this worldly attitude and a decline in morality and idealism. The nihilistic message of scientists who apparently valued technique over soul and integrity was even blamed for the devastation of the Lost War, or the First World War, it was said, in which victory was no longer decided by the spiritual and mental resistance of men, but by the predominance of mechanical instruments of power. In a similar fashion, Husemann also talked about the takeover of the world by this mechanistic thinking. He actually used the word Machtergreifung, or the power grab of the University of Science. And to those who are familiar with the history of the Third Reich in German, this is also the term used to talk about the Nazis coming to power. He continued by comparing university science to a company, stating that university science uses state funds and dominates the world, but is not held accountable for the consequences of itself, whereas in a company you would have consequences. As one of the consequences of university science's taking over of the world, Husemann named the destruction of nature. And he added that all these are consequences of not taking Goethe seriously. And I'm quoting him, Goethe did not want to question this part of science, he said, but to complement and expand it. One of the themes I find especially interesting in trying to understand the relationship between science and spirituality among the anthroposophical circles is how science itself figures differently in different conversations, or even in the same conversation. I would argue that this difference stems from an uneasy relationship with science. Science refers to at once to university science, Husemann mentions, or sometimes glossed over as natural science. At other times, it refers to more to the scientific method or a certain kind of systematicity of observation, such as what Goethe or Steiner did, or what Steiner called the spiritual science or Geisteswissenschaft. And I mean, as you well know, like Geisteswissenschaft, interestingly in English, it can refer to both spiritual science and humanities, which comes from this doubleness of the word Geist that can refer to both mind and spirit. Speaking in genealogical terms, what they now call university science is the victor of contestations over what counts as legitimate science today for institutions that hold power to define what science is in contemporary academia. I'll call this science Science 1 for practicality during this presentation. Science 2 then is a more general understanding of science, science as method or science or a science that was capacious enough before the turn of the 20th century that included holistic science, a science that does not necessarily focus on the parts rather than the whole, in which phenomenological analysis and observation were not excluded from science proper. Of course, these are not as easily separable from each other in contemporary science. However, dominant Science 1 does have influences from Science 2 and vice versa. Though when it comes to dominant discourses of science, there's at least a pretense about the quote-unquote purity of Science 1. From the perspective of science and technology studies, or the SDS, a field of knowledge that acknowledges from the outset that science is always affected by history, politics, and economy, and a less acknowledged addition, religion and spirituality, none of this is new. I'm also thinking with the SDS scholar Tom Skieran here and his term boundary work in understanding how anthroposophists make science spiritual and the spiritual scientific. Kieran uses the term boundary work to describe the strategies, actions, and arguments employed by scientists and other actors to define, protect, and negotiate the boundaries between legitimate science and other forms of knowledge or practice. He categorizes these strategies under three headings. First, expulsion, where what is considered non-scientific gets excluded from the so-called legitimate sphere of science. The way anthroposophy and especially anthroposophical medicine is discussed in the mainstream media as pseudoscience in Germany can be an example of such expulsion. Second, expansion, when either the boundaries of science extend to include other spheres in its purview or other spheres push back against science. This does take place in contested domains such as complementary and alternative medicine, where, for instance, one of the leading medical schools in Germany, Charité in Berlin, has a research group that works on anthroposophical medicine. Third, protection of autonomy, which refers to the efforts made by scientists to preserve the independence and self-regulation of scientific community. When its practitioners refer to anthroposophy as spiritual science, they also attempt to apply such independence and authority to their field of study. But although Guerin's terms helps us understand some aspects of anthroposophy, it mostly speaks from the perspective of the mainstream and quote-unquote legitimate scientists who are making these claims to distinguish themselves from the others. What anthroposophists do in their scientific endeavors, however, is not only to move the boundaries of science and spirituality, but also to attempt to remove the boundary altogether, making science spiritual and the spiritual scientific. One example I originally wanted to talk about is the work of Matthias Rang, who brings Goethe's method and the theory of color into today's physics research. As I mentioned, he was also one of the speakers at the accompanying conference for the exhibition, but having seen that he will talk about his work himself in the next session, I will just briefly gloss over what he and the natural science section in the Goetheanum do in the context of my presentation. Thinking together with the idea of boundary work, Rang's research applies Goetheanism to physics, but what I find important here to emphasize that he and the team articulate this research for scientific audiences by publishing in scientific journals. In a way, they blur the boundaries between Science 1 and Science 2 by making science spiritual. In a similar vein, I'd also like to name Christoph Hueck's work. Hueck has a PhD in molecular biology and genetics and has conducted research in Germany and the US, including at Harvard. Nowadays, though, he's doing something more interesting for my research besides co-running the Acanthus Academy and being a very active proponent of Goethean research or science. And namely, he's publishing articles in philosophy of science journals about Goethe and Steiner's work. To name one example, in one of his recent publications titled Rational Organicism, Goethe, Steiner, and the Intuitive Understanding of Plants and Animals, he argues that Goethe's concept of the archetypal plant, as further developed by Rudolf Steiner, offers a rational, empirically informed method for grasping organic form through productive intuition, a mental reconstruction of an organism's formative principles. Extending this approach to animals, he reconstructs an animal archetype based on sensory, nutritive, and motor functions, concluding that Goethe's rational organicism provides a valuable methodological complement to contemporary philosophies of biology concerned with autonomy and agency. The term productive intuition comes directly from Steiner's work, which he uses for this disciplined form of imagination grounded in observation. It means mentally reconstructing how an organism develops and organizes itself, not guessing, but a rigorous experiential way of thinking through form and process. In this example, we can see how science becomes spiritualized, but also how the spiritual becomes scientific. Inspired by Goethe's systematic observation, Steiner's use of productive intuition brings elements of scientific method, such as being rigorous in observation, into the realm of the spiritual. In both Rang's and Hugh's work, we can see how the boundaries between spirituality and science not only shift, but blur, becoming more porous than we tend to imagine them. Goethe's work is central to this blurring as he brings a perspective from a time when such boundaries were not distinctly established. I also attended an online course specifically designed to introduce medical practitioners to anthroposophical medicine, taught mostly by medical doctors actively working at anthroposophical hospitals in Germany and Switzerland. The course consists of modules focusing on different conceptions of the body in anthroposophical medicine, namely the physical body, the etheric body, the astral body, and the eye organization. I'll not go into the detail in explaining what these bodies do, especially to this audience, but very briefly for those who may not know, the etheric body roughly corresponds to the life force, the astral body to the soul, and the eye organization to self-consciousness. In one of these lectures, Friedrich, and this time I'm using a synonym because this wasn't a public presentation like the others, a doctor in his late 30s, went into scientific mysteries, phenomena that are not explained by the current scientific research, and the new methodologies that might be required to solve these mysteries.
Just to let you, sorry to interrupt, you have about 4 minutes to wrap up.
Sure, thank you. Just as an example, one of the mysteries was the specialization of cells in embryonic development and how cells move to shape the human body, which apparently is not still explained by biomedicine or biology, but there are anthropological explanations about the effects of planets on embryonic development, for instance. Friedrich started explaining basic scientific methodologies used in biomedicine, such as basic research, preclinical studies and laboratory research, clinical research and randomized studies, qualitative research with surveys and interviews, and healthcare provision research focusing on issues like effectiveness or drug safety. Then he went on to explain the impact of Goetheanism on clinical research. From this point onward, he introduced a variety of different methods inspired by Goetheanism and anthroposophy. To give you a brief overview, these are formative forces research or Bildkräfteforschung, sculptural, musical, and speech-based knowledge of the human being, meditative research, and spiritual research. I want to stay with formative forces research because it provides an interesting example in thinking with different logics at play here. So Friedrich explained formative forces research as a way of finding out the forces active in different processes through inner perception. Let me give you a medical example Friedrich provided. In discussing thrombosis, for instance, the formation of blood clot inside the blood vessel, he drew a distinction between two ways of understanding what's happening in the body. In conventional medicine, he said, scientists usually break the clotting process into a sequence of biochemical steps. So factor A activates factor B, factor B activates C, and so on, because this allows them to intervene at a specific point. But he suggests that this component-based view does not really capture the process unfolding in living tissue. If you look at thrombosis as it develops in flowing blood, we see a different picture. Clot formation is a condensing or hardening process that begins at an injured point of the vessel wall. So inflammation, by contrast, represents a dissolving process aimed at breaking down intruders and restoring integrity. So for him, recognizing these opposing tendencies, so condensation and dissolution, opens up a different way of thinking therapeutically. It allows clinicians to ask, what does this particular patient need more of in this particular moment? Support for condensation or support for dissolution? In the end, Friedrich suggested that Goetheanism could address the crisis in modern science, where excessive specialization and reliance on technology lead to a loss of direct perception and understanding the whole. Here, he was obviously referring to Science 1. But what I find important to emphasize here is that all these scientists that I mentioned in this presentation so far indeed do science by blurring the boundaries between science and spirituality. And I would add, they hint at employing anthroposophy and, more generally, spirituality as a resource available for scientists. For this resource to be taken up, however, we should move beyond the conflict narratives between science and spirituality and be more open to the possibility of a science, knowledge, and an episteme otherwise. Thank you.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, Preston Fellows of Harvard College.